If I had known that happy birthday would be the last time I would say it to my father with a sincere smile, maybe I wouldn't have gone. But I did, and I was humiliated. My name is Laila Bennett. I am 32 years old, and until recently my last name meant nothing to the Bennett family. I grew up in a home where success was measured by the size of the watch on your wrist and the make of the car in the driveway. My father, Richard Bennett, was the quintessential Atlanta real estate mogul, always with a new acquisition to show off and a disappointment to point out in his children. I, the middle child, never lived up to expectations. My older sister, Chelsea, followed the perfection playbook: Ivy League college, marriage to a renowned lawyer, impeccable attendance at high society events. My younger brother, Nathan, was the protege, the prodigy dad thought would inherit everything. And me? I was always the creative one, the troublemaker, the alternative, the one who chose to study product design instead of business, the one who quit a stable job to start a business, the one who, according to my father, was still finding herself, even in her 30s. The truth is, I did find myself. Only no one in my family bothered to notice. The invitation to my father's 70th birthday party arrived with great pomp and circumstance. A burgundy envelope with gold lettering in relief. Formal attire. Location: Bennett Hall. Of course, it would be at the family mansion, the one that looks like it came out of an architecture magazine, and where every room holds more ego than history. I thought about not going. After all, it had been over a year since we last spoke in person, but something inside me, perhaps a childish remnant of wanting to be seen, made me accept. I spent weeks preparing, not just for my appearance, although I invested more than I could afford in an elegant dress and a gala-worthy hairstyle, but emotionally. I practiced smiling in front of the mirror, rehearsed answers to indiscreet questions, imagined 1,000 times what it would be like to be welcomed as part of the family and not as a burden tolerated out of obligation. However, as soon as I arrived, I realized that nothing had changed. The main gate slowly opened, revealing the immaculately lit garden. Luxury cars filled the circular driveway, and the muffled sound of a string quartet drifted from the main porch. A security guard looked at my name on the list and hesitated. That was enough to make me uncomfortable. After confirming with a radio, he nodded and let me in, as if I were an exception. Inside the house, I was greeted with mixed looks: surprise, condescension, and a little pity. Chelsea saw me first. She came with that smile that never reaches her eyes. "Laila, what a surprise!" she said, as if I were a distant acquaintance who had shown up unannounced. "You look beautiful. Did you find that dress yourself?" Before I could answer, she pulled me in for a selfie. I could barely smile. The guests were a mix of business people, politicians, and old family friends. Conversations about investments and luxury travel dominated the rooms. And there, in the middle of it all, I was a fish out of water, trying to look like a mermaid. When I saw my father, he was surrounded by people, laughing loudly with a glass of whiskey in his hand. I walked over to him, my heart racing. He looked me up and down and said, "I thought you weren't coming." His voice wasn't relieved or happy. It was almost accusatory. "I hope you're not here with any ulterior motives. The will is still the same." It hit me like a punch in the stomach. The people around us pretended not to hear, but I felt the weight of their stares. My hands started to sweat. My throat went dry. "I just came to celebrate your birthday, Dad. Nothing else." He shook his head, as if he didn't believe me, or worse, as if he didn't care. The evening was a series of uncomfortable moments. Forced laughter, interrupted conversations, passive-aggressive comments. At one point, I heard my aunt whispering to another guest, "She's the one who tried to start a company selling, I don't know what. Recyclable products, can you imagine? A sustainability CEO, lol." The other one scoffed. And there I was, pretending not to listen, swallowing every shred of pride as if it were dessert. Until, near the end of the night, as I was getting ready to leave early, something happened. 3 tall men in dark suits appeared through the side door. They looked out of place at the party, like 5-star hotel security guards. One of them spotted me in the middle of the room and walked over to me. "Ms. Bennett?" he asked. Everyone around us stopped. All eyes turned to us. "Yes?" I replied, startled. He smiled, unflinching. "The car is ready, CEO. We need to take you to your meeting with investors in Buckhead. The board is already in session." Silence. A heavy silence fell like a veil over the entire room. My father turned slowly. Chelsea's eyes widened. Someone choked on their drink. And that was it. That was the exact moment when everything changed. Whenever people ask me how it all started, I'm tempted to say it was the day I dropped out of business school, just 1 semester before graduating, and decided to pursue a completely different path. But if I'm honest, it started long before that. It started with looks, with comparisons, with loud silences. In my family, success had a strict standard: high grades, prestige, poise. It was all about appearances. Being a Bennett meant being flawless, or at least appearing to be. Mom was the pillar of the family's public image, always with a rehearsed smile and tailor-made dresses. She passed away early when I was still in high school, and that only reinforced my father's demands for perfection. His grief was never visible. He just became more rigid, more silent. Chelsea was born with a sparkle that lit up any room. She was the poster child for the family, disciplined, polished, always saying what Dad wanted to hear. Nathan, the youngest, was the patriarch's joy, interested in numbers, quiet, but strategically involved in the business from an early age. Me, well, I was always the one asking why, the one who wanted to understand what was behind the rules, the one who took toys apart to see how they worked. At 12, I made my own water filter with activated charcoal and plastic bottles. At 14, I turned cardboard boxes into handmade lamps and sold them at the neighborhood fair. My dad never saw any value in these things. He said they were hippie stuff, but it was in college that the distance between us became a chasm. I majored in business administration to please others, to pretend I could fit in, but with each semester, my soul withered. It wasn't for me. I liked to create, to imagine solutions with purpose. I liked sustainability, functional design, social impact. I couldn't see myself selling luxury apartments to foreign investors or participating in meetings where every sentence was a facade. It was in an elective product design class that I finally breathed. The teacher, a man named Jonah, encouraged bold ideas and talked about companies that changed entire communities with simple solutions. I remember leaving that class and crying in my car. For the first time, I felt like I had found where I belonged. I had a difficult conversation with my dad that same month. I told him I wanted to change majors, that I wanted to create something with purpose. He looked at me as if I had spat on the table. "What do you want to be? A craftswoman at a fair?" he said, without even trying to hide his contempt. "I want to create sustainable solutions. I want to develop products that help real people." I tried to explain. He laughed, a dry laugh. "Laila, you were born to lead, but you're choosing to fail." Still, I changed courses. And that's when things changed for good. There were no more calls on holidays. There was no support. Chelsea kept sending me messages with links to internships at serious companies. Nathan stopped responding to my messages. And Dad, he just pretended I didn't exist. But I kept going. I started small. I did freelance work for startups. I developed prototypes for recyclable household items. I saved money by selling composting kits for apartments. Before long, I created Vertiviva, my sustainable design startup. It was tiny, almost artisanal, but I was alive. It was the first time I woke up wanting to go to work. I met incredible people along the way, people who believed in social impact, who wanted to do something different. One day, at an innovation event in Austin, I presented a prototype air purifier for public schools. A European fund took an interest. The project went viral. In 6 months, my small office became a team of 10 people. We received investment. I was invited to speak at conferences. Without realizing it, I had become a real entrepreneur. But at home, none of that mattered. When I mentioned to Chelsea, on a rare phone call, that my startup had been valued at 7 figures after a round of investment, she replied, "That's great that you're having fun with it, but you know you'll have to come back to reality at some point, right?" That hurt, but it didn't surprise me. Their reality was different from mine. Their reality was made up of expensive dinners, real estate, stocks. Mine was made up of real people, sustainable ideas, empathy. And yet, even though I had built all this on my own, even though I had impacted schools, communities, families, part of me still wanted my father's recognition. I pretended not to. I told myself he didn't matter anymore. But with every achievement I didn't share, there was a stifled cry. With every award I didn't mention, there was a silent wound. That's why, when the birthday invitation arrived, even though I knew I wouldn't be welcome, I went. Not for him, but for me. To prove, perhaps only to myself, that I was enough, that I was strong. I just didn't imagine it would be so hard to face that world again, so suffocating, so cruel. Nor did I imagine that what was to come would change everything. The first time I realized there was something wrong with the way my family saw me, I was 10 years old. It was Christmas. I had made a picture frame out of recycled cardboard, hot glue, and pebbles from the garden, a handmade gift for my father. He opened the package, looked at it for a few seconds, and said in a neutral voice, "Very creative, Laila, but next time, ask the maid to wrap it better. It's a little dirty." Meanwhile, Chelsea handed him a gift she had bought with his credit card, a designer blazer, and him, He laughed loudly, hugged her, and spun her around in the air. I stood there, smiling to no one. That day, I learned that effort only had value if it fit their standards. In my teens, this intensified. My different clothes were the butt of jokes at family dinners. My naturally curly hair, which I began to wear with pride after years of forced straightening, was called rebellious by my grandmother. My father subtly suggested that I dress up more so as not to give the wrong impression. There was always a subtext. I wasn't worthy of the Bennett surname, not the way I was. But it was in adulthood that the signs became more cruel and more veiled. I would show up at family gatherings and notice chairs being taken on purpose before I arrived. I was the last to be served. The conversations, always about the stock market or international politics, would change course when I approached. If I tried to participate, someone would change the subject or simply ignore me. And there was always a little joke. "How's your eco-friendly business going?" Nathan would say with a mocking smile. "And the recyclable products? Are you making more than Uber yet?" My uncle would add, laughing as if he had said the funniest thing in the world. "What do you do, Layla? Is it like selling pretty trash?" A cousin asked me once while drinking wine. No one corrected them. No one found it offensive. It was as if I were the eccentric mascot of the group, useful only for moments of mockery or to make them feel superior. For years, I tried to mold myself. I wore clothes that weren't mine. I hid my projects. I spoke less, listened more. I smiled, even when everything inside me was screaming. I hoped that if I fit in just a little, they would accept me. But acceptance there came at too high a price, giving up who I was. Deep down, my family never saw me as an adult. To them, I was the confused teenager who still needed guidance and correction. It was as if my growth, personal, professional, emotional, was invalid, as if I could only be relevant if I followed the path they had laid out for me. I remember a lunch when I proudly announced that Verdaviva had signed a contract with a public school system to install air purifiers made from recycled materials. It had environmental, social, and educational impact. I was thrilled. My father replied without looking up from his plate, "That's great, but what about the financial return? Any real profit? Because charity is easy when you don't have to worry about the bottom line at the end of the month." I was speechless. Chelsea, with that indulgent smile, added, "She's an idealist, Dad. She always has been. She needs to grow up, right?" That stuck in my throat for days. And then came the practical exclusions. Invitations sent at the last minute, family decisions made without me, emotional inheritances passed between Chelsea and Nathan as if I were invisible. When my grandmother died, she left an emerald necklace to Chelsea and an old gold pen to Nathan. I got a blank letter. Literally. An empty envelope. I was told it was a typo in the will, but no one bothered to correct it. I felt like I didn't belong, that I was only there out of biological obligation. But even with all that, I kept coming back. It was the weight of family. It was the silly hope that maybe one day someone would recognize me, that my father would look at me and say, I was wrong, that Chelsea would drop the superiority act, that Nathan would admit he underestimated me. It never happened. And that was the wound I carried to the 70th birthday party, a place where every detail seemed to have been carefully planned to show who deserved to be there, where the red carpets and Italian crystal seemed to say, Layla, this isn't for you. And deep down, they really believed it. For a long time, I thought the distance was just emotional, that the wounds were silent and limited to words, looks, veiled judgment. But no, my family wasn't content with just devaluing me. They needed to restrain me, limit me, keep me in my place. The control started subtly, with advice disguised as concern. Have you thought about going back to corporate life? My father would ask me, like someone offering a rope to someone drowning. These sustainable projects are nice, but they don't pay the bills. I can talk to Daniel at the finance group. Maybe he can get you in as an image consultant, my aunt would say, as if my career were a hobby in decline. At the time, I responded calmly, trying to keep the peace. But every suggestion was loaded with the idea that my independence was unstable, that my company, even though it was growing, was just a whim with an expiration date. And then came the veiled threats. Once, when I declined an invitation to a formal family dinner because I had a presentation for investors that same evening, my father called me, something he rarely did. You're choosing your priorities poorly, Layla. Family comes first, he said, his voice low and controlled. With all due respect, Dad, my company is also my family. And it's my responsibility, I replied, trying not to tremble. There was silence for a few seconds, and then he said, You still depend on our last name, and I can take that away at any time. The phone went dead. It was as if ice ran down my spine. The threat was symbolic, of course. I didn't use the Bennett name in my business, nor did I ask for favors. But that sentence, it showed how he saw himself, as someone who allowed me to exist, who tolerated me in the world because, somehow, he felt he owed me that. And he wasn't alone. Chelsea began to subtly infiltrate my connections. Once, a contact at an investment fund told me he had received a polite but pointed email from someone in my family, warning that my business was well-intentioned but unstable. The investor didn't say who, but I knew. Nathan, for his part, made a point of spreading doubts about my financial results at family gatherings. He commented that I must be hiding losses because no one sees real returns in the recycled trash business. These constant attacks began to affect me more than I would admit. Not outwardly, I kept working, growing, delivering results. But inside, I was becoming exhausted, tired of justifying myself, tired of protecting myself even from my own family. The greatest proof of control came when I discovered, by chance, that my father had tried to buy the building where my headquarters was located. One of the property's partners, an influential businessman, called me in for an informal meeting. He seemed concerned. "Laila, your father offered triple the market value. He said he wanted to protect his daughter from herself. But something doesn't seem right. Did you know about this?" No, I didn't, and I was shocked. That building was symbolic to me. It was where I had built everything, where I had hired my first employee, where I had given my first conference, where my prototype air purifier had been developed. He wanted to buy it to get me out of there. Or worse, to remind me that even then he could still interfere, that he still thought he could decide what was best for me. That was when I realized what was at stake. My autonomy wasn't just a matter of professional independence. It was a fight for my existence, for my freedom to be who I was, without having to ask permission, without having to constantly prove my worth to a family that wanted me molded, silenced, obedient. I became a prisoner of a logic in which any step outside the traditional path was treated as a mistake, as delusional. And the worst part? I felt alone in all of this, because no matter how much I had a team, friends, a support network, the silence of my own family hurt more than any criticism from outside. It was the kind of pain that ate away at me from the inside out, a void that only exists when those who should welcome you are the ones who want to erase you. My father never had to raise his voice to control me. A subtle phrase, a gesture of contempt, a decision made without consulting me was enough. Chelsea never had to yell. She just smiled and talked to others as if I weren't in the room. Nathan didn't need to be aggressive. All he had to do was laugh quietly at the end of his sentences, as if he knew something I didn't. I was still an adult. I was still a CEO. I was still resilient. But inside that invisible web of contempt and control, I was suffocating. And the worst part is that, for a long time, I let it happen. Because when we grow up thinking that love must be earned, we learn to swallow pain like medicine, until our bodies can't take it anymore. There are wounds that you learn to hide even from yourself. But there comes a point when the body reveals what the mind insists on suppressing. It was on an ordinary morning, as I was getting ready for another virtual meeting with potential international partners, that I noticed my hands shaking uncontrollably. I tried to adjust the camera, but my reflection seemed distant, pale, tired, as if I were inhabiting another body. The dark circles under my eyes were no longer just cosmetic. They were marks of sleepless nights, of thoughts that hammered relentlessly. Am I overreacting? Am I really winning? Is my father right? I began to feel an exhaustion that could not be relieved by sleep or silence. It was like a tiredness of the soul. I was fading away amid so much effort to prove that I deserved to exist on my own. My sister's passive-aggressive messages kept coming. "I saw that you started a fundraising campaign in communities. Very noble. But be careful, okay? Those places are dangerous. People like you don't know much about the streets. People like you." Those 3 words echoed for days. It wasn't just about the work I did. It was about who I was. It was about my skin tone, my background, my choices. It was about not fitting into the white, rich, discreet, and domesticated mold of the elite I grew up with. It was about making a point of talking about the roots they tried to hide, about continuing to wear my hair natural, about going to meetings in clothes made by independent designers instead of wearing the dresses Chelsea kept recommending. The tension was constant, and my body felt it. I started having anxiety attacks. I would wake up in the middle of the night with my heart racing. I felt like I always had to be one step ahead, as if my life were an endless job interview where I had to convince the world that I was competent enough to occupy my own space. During a lunch with investors at a fancy midtown rooftop, I simply froze. One of the guests mentioned that my approach was too passionate for the market. I smiled, as always, trying not to confront him, but inside, something collapsed. I left the table, went into the bathroom, and collapsed on the cold floor, crying with my head between my knees. I called my therapist that same afternoon. It was time to admit it. I wasn't okay. She was blunt. Layla, you've been in a constant state of alert for years. That's trauma. Trauma from invalidation. Trauma from being silenced. From chronic exclusion. You're constantly trying to prove your worth to people who have already decided not to see you. I took a deep breath. It hurt to hear it, but it was true. Everything in my life revolved around validation that never came. My company, a cry for independence, my achievements, a desperate attempt to finally be seen. My silence at every family dinner, a way to not bother anyone, to deserve some leftover affection. I was suffocating, and as if the emotional pressure wasn't enough, Verde Viva began to go through a delicate period. One of our main suppliers faced logistical problems, delaying essential deliveries. An important contract was postponed due to bureaucratic issues. Nothing catastrophic, but enough to destabilize me. I tried to keep a calm face in front of the team, but inside, I was falling apart. And then, as if the universe had planned the perfect scene, came the invitation to my father's 70th birthday party. I hesitated for days. I knew it wouldn't be easy, that nothing would change, but I also knew that if I didn't go, they would use my absence as further proof that I didn't care about my family. And part of me still wanted to be part of that. Part of what I grew up believing was love. I prepared myself as if I were going to war. I bought an elegant dress, with a simple cut and a bold color. I carefully did my hair and applied light but subtle makeup, and I smiled at myself in the mirror. It wasn't a real smile, but I hoped I could keep it up for a few hours. When I entered that house, I immediately felt the tension. It was as if the air itself was judgmental. People looked at me with a mixture of surprise and discomfort, as if asking, "She still exists?" I was greeted with short hugs and long looks. Empty comments like, "Wow, you look different," or "Still with that green stuff company?" And my father looked at me like I was a reminder of what hadn't worked out. The party was beautiful. Expensive flowers, live piano music, crystal glasses, but nothing there felt welcoming to me. It was a scene of vanity, and I was a discordant element. I stayed as little as possible. I sat in the corner. I smiled for the photographers. I took slow sips of cheap sparkling wine disguised in an expensive bottle. And just when I thought about leaving discreetly, something happened that would change everything. 3 men in suits, who looked like they had stepped out of a diplomatic entourage, crossed the room. All eyes turned to them. One of them found me, approached me with a firm stance, and said, "Ms. Bennett, your team is already in position. The meeting room in Buckhead is ready. The board is waiting for the CEO." And at that exact moment, all my fragility exploded into strength. In that hall, decorated with golden chandeliers and an orchestra playing Bach in the background, the silence that followed those words, "The board is waiting for the CEO," was more deafening than any scream I could have let out. For a moment, no one reacted. The glasses stopped in midair, the conversation ceased, and all eyes, including his, my father's, were on me. I could see something on his face that I had never seen before. Confusion, and beneath the confusion, fear. It wasn't fear of me, but fear of what that word, CEO, meant to the guests. Fear of how it dismantled the narrative he had sustained for years, that I was an erratic, failed daughter, too stubborn to be taken seriously. For a moment, I wanted to run away. Part of me still sought his permission, his recognition, but that Layla, the one who trembled with insecurity, who begged for crumbs of affection, who accepted jokes as a form of love, she was no longer there. "Yes, I'm ready," I replied to the security guard, my voice firm, my chin lifted. And then I started walking. My footsteps echoed across the marble like a parade of redemption. People made way for me. Some murmured. Others just stared at me, as if they were seeing someone for the first time. When I passed Chelsea, I saw her expression break. That confidence she always had dissolved into a look of astonishment. She looked at her father, then at me, and finally lowered her eyes. It was the first time I had ever seen her speechless. Nathan, on the other hand, tried to laugh. He forced out a comment. "Ah, what a wonderful performance! It's like a French perfume commercial." But no one laughed with him. I reached the exit, with the 3 security guards around me. The car outside was discreet but luxurious. And next to me, one of them muttered, "The Chinese investor has just landed. Everything is under control. Shall we go?" I nodded, but before leaving I turned around, and I saw my father still standing in the same place, with the glass in his hand. His hand was shaking. For a moment, I wondered if he would come to me, call me, say he was proud, that he was wrong, that he loved me. even without understanding. But he didn't move. It was at that moment that something inside me finally broke. An invisible bond, an old knot, a guilt that wasn't mine. I didn't need that anymore. The pain that had held me captive for years turned to clarity in that instant. My father didn't hate me. He just didn't know how to love what he couldn't control. He saw love as obedience, pride as a reflection of himself. And I was always too free to fit into that mold. I got into the car. I took a deep breath. I felt the cold leather of the seat and the subtle vibration of the engine. And for the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to truly smile. That night, I wasn't just the CEO of Verda Viva. I was the CEO of my own story. And more important than the impact on social media or my presence on the board was the silence I left in that room, a silence full of shame, theirs, and finally, without a trace of me. The next day, my picture was on the website of an international business magazine next to the Chinese investor. The headline, American Sustainable Entrepreneur Attracts $1 Million Investment. New partnership promises to revolutionize the public school sector. I received hundreds of messages, congratulations, invitations to events, calls for interviews. But the ones that impacted me the most were the ones that didn't come. No call from my sister, no message from my brother, and of course, nothing from my father. And at that moment, it didn't matter anymore. That absence was no longer a wound. It was just space. Space where I could finally grow without having to shrink to fit into anyone's heart. The morning after that memorable night, I woke up early. The Atlanta sky was clear, the air had a rare freshness, and the silence in my apartment seemed less heavy. There were no messages from my family, no notifications on my phone with belated apologies or attempts at reconciliation. Nothing. And for the first time, it didn't hurt. On the contrary, it was as if I finally had space to hear myself, without the noise of other people's expectations, without the echo of veiled criticism, without the constant need to prove myself. I stood in front of the mirror, my eyes still tired, but my chest strangely light. The woman staring back at me reflected more than fatigue. She bore the marks of battle, and the serene glow of someone who had finally broken free from a cycle. It was time to rebuild myself, but not from scratch. Because in truth, I was already whole, just covered by layers of doubts imposed by those who never really knew me. I decided to start with my home. I donated objects that I had kept just because they looked professional, or because they made me look like a reliable executive. Self-help books that promised approval, clothes that my sister had once said made me look more credible. Little by little, I removed everything from my life that wasn't truly mine. That same week, I called my team together for a different kind of meeting. Today, we're not going to talk about goals or reports. We're going to talk about purpose. I told them everything I had been through. I told them about the party, about the moment of realization, about how our mission went far beyond contracts or results. Verda Viva wasn't created to impress investors. It was created to make an impact, a real human impact. And that's what we're going to focus on from now on. We began to reformulate our projects. I created a mentoring program with young people from communities who wanted to start sustainable businesses. I strengthened partnerships with technical schools. I gave visibility to employees who were making a difference away from the spotlight. Each new initiative was a step toward the Laila I had hidden for so long. I also went back to therapy more often. And there, in the sessions, I was able to face old wounds that still whispered doubts. Laila, are you ready to move on without having to win every day? My therapist asked me in a session that stuck with me. I took a while to answer. I'm ready to live, even when I don't win. For the first time, I embraced the idea that I didn't have to be living proof of constant overcoming, that I could rest, that it was possible to be at peace even without being recognized by those who should love me. Over time, I also began to rebuild my emotional network. Old friends came back into my life. Some Verda Viva employees became close friends, not just at work, but in my personal life as well. One of them, Malik, our chief engineer, sent me a note after a meeting. Seeing you on that stage yesterday made me believe that I too can break out of the mold they put me in. That touched me deeply, because all my life I wanted to be heard by my family, but now I was being heard by those who really mattered, by people who dream, who create, who feel, by people who don't want to maintain systems, but to reinvent them. I also started visiting the communities we worked with more often. One school in particular made an impression on me. It was an old building in the Grove Park neighborhood, where we had implemented a sustainable air filtration system. A girl pulled me by the hand and said, "Are you the lady who makes the school smell clean?" I smiled with tears in my eyes. "You can call me that, yes." That day, I understood that there is no title more beautiful than that. At home, a thick envelope arrived in the mail. No return address. I recognized the handwriting. It was from my father. I opened it carefully. Inside was a copy of his updated will, and a single sentence written by hand. You were right, but not because of the company, because of your courage. I don't know if he wanted to apologize, or just close a chapter. I didn't reply, not out of hurt, but by choice. Because at that moment, I understood that my life no longer needed to revolve around him. I prepared a new speech for a TEDx event in New Orleans, where I was invited to talk about innovation and belonging. It was my first big public speech since the party. I started with a sentence that summed it all up. Sometimes, the most liberating silence is the one you leave behind. And the room erupted in applause. Some battles aren't fought with shouting. They happen in the tense silence of a dining room, in the careful choice of words that stand alone, or even in the simple act of showing up without asking permission. It was on a cloudy Sunday when the phone rang with Chelsea's number. I hesitated. Her name on the screen no longer made me angry, but it didn't bring me peace either. I answered on impulse. Hi, Layla. Hi, Chelsea. Dad's in the hospital. It's nothing serious, but we thought you should know. Her voice sounded more restrained than usual, almost uncomfortable. Thanks for letting me know. He's asking about you. He doesn't say it directly, but you know how he is. I was silent. So many things were going through my mind. Should I go? What did they expect of me? In the late afternoon, I went. Not to fulfill expectations, but to end a cycle. I arrived at the hospital with steady steps. I didn't bring flowers. I didn't bring excuses. I brought only myself, whole, serene, aware of what I represented. My father was lying down, reading the newspaper, with IV tubes connected to his arm and tired eyes. When he saw me, he slowly lowered the paper. Did you come to see me? He said, with an almost ironic tone. I came for myself, I replied. There was a heavy silence, the same kind of silence that had filled that birthday room weeks earlier. I hear you impressed the investors, he said after a few seconds. It wasn't to impress. It was to build something bigger than myself. He nodded. He looked out the window, then back at me. You've always had that obstinacy. You always thought it was rebellion, I replied calmly. Maybe it was fear of losing control. He paused. I knew that if you went your own way, you wouldn't come back, and I would lose my only chance to mold you in my own image. That was perhaps the most honest thing he ever said to me. It was never your job to mold me, I replied. It was your job to welcome me. He looked away. I messed up with you, Layla, but I don't know how to be any different. You don't have to be different because of me. You just have to understand that now. I am. We stood there in silence, two strangers with the same blood, separated by everything that had been left unsaid for decades. Before leaving, I approached the bed and said, tenderly but firmly, I forgive you, but I'm not coming back. Not to the place you gave me in that family. Not to the role of a daughter who has to beg for space. Not to that narrative where there are only two types of people, the successful ones who fit in and the ones who disappoint. I'm writing my own story, and in it, Dad, I'm the protagonist, not a supporting character in someone else's legacy. He closed his eyes and nodded. A single tear rolled down his cheek. It was the last time we saw each other in person. A few days later, I was invited to a family brunch. Chelsea sent me a message. I think it would be good for all of us. It's been too long. I thought about it. I took a deep breath, and I accepted. This time, I went with a different mindset. I wore a simple but elegant dress. My hair was down, and I wore light makeup. No armor, no fear. When I arrived, the stares came as they always did, but now they didn't pierce me. They bounced off me, because something in me had changed. Layla, said my sister, hugging me with that formal smile. I'm so glad you came. I came because I chose to, not because I expected anything. We sat down. The comments started. The table is full of CEOs today, said Nathan with a smile. And to think you started out selling trash. It wasn't trash. It was a solution. You just didn't understand. This time, no one laughed. A cousin coughed, embarrassed. My aunt looked at her plate. Chelsea fell silent. I refused to participate in the jokes disguised as affection. I refused to smile to keep the peace. I wasn't rude, but I was clear. And that clarity was more disconcerting than any scream. When lunch was over, one detail struck me. My grandmother, the quietest of them all, held my hand and whispered, I should have defended you before. You have your mother's strength, and that was enough. That afternoon, I left that house with a peace I had never felt before. Not because I was accepted, but because for the first time, I no longer needed their acceptance. Today, looking back, I realized that the real revolution in my life was not becoming CEO. It wasn't gaining recognition in the media or signing million-dollar contracts with international partners. My revolution was internal. It was breaking the cycle of emotional dependence on a family that only knew how to love those who fit the mold. It was learning to build a home within myself, where all versions of me fit, even the ones they never accepted. After that last lunch, I never tried to participate in my family's image games again. Not out of contempt, but by choice. I knew I no longer fit into that theater. And to be honest, I didn't want to fit in. My life is now organized around real purposes. Verde Viva has become a hub for social innovation. We've expanded outside Atlanta and now have projects in Detroit, Oakland, and indigenous communities in Arizona. We've implemented low-cost water treatment stations, promoted women's empowerment in neglected neighborhoods, and created a fund to support Black women entrepreneurs in the early stages of their careers. Our team is diverse, not just in body, but in mind. Here, no one has to fit into a mold to be respected. I learned that leadership isn't about setting the pace. It's about listening, adjusting, and walking alongside others. And I, Laila Bennett, am no longer a shadow on the margins of my own story. Today, I give talks at schools where girls ask me how to resist when the world insists on erasing them. And I respond, start by turning on the light inside you, and then protect that light with everything you've got. But above all, I've learned to live more gently. I've learned that I don't have to prove anything to anyone, that I can fail, that I can rest, that I can just be Laila, at home, at work, in life. The updated will my father sent me is still tucked away in a drawer. I never contested it, never brought it up, not out of indifference, but because I already have everything he never knew how to give me: clarity, autonomy, and peace. And his absence on important dates no longer hurts. I have filled that space with real relationships, with chosen loved ones, with bonds built on trust and respect, not blood and obligation. I have reconciled myself with my history, with the years of insecurity, with the painful silences, with the dinners where I felt invisible. All of this has brought me here. And today, when I walk into a room, I don't need anyone to call me CEO, because being CEO was just a consequence. What I really am is free. And that freedom, that courage to be who I am, without asking permission, is the legacy I will leave to the world.